The morning of September 19, 1944, did not begin with the heroic fanfare of a Hollywood epic, but with a cold, suffocating silence that clung to the French countryside of Lorraine. Near the small village of Arracourt, a thick, milky fog rolled through the valleys, reducing visibility to a mere few dozen yards and swallowing the sounds of the waking world. Inside the command post of Combat Command A, Fourth Armored Division, Colonel Bruce Clarke stared at a map that offered no comfort. The intelligence reports arriving at his desk were nothing short of apocalyptic. Moving through that very fog was the Fifth Panzer Army, a steel juggernaut commanded by Hasso von Monteuffel, consisting of 2 fresh panzer brigades and over 260 tanks. Among them were the sleek, lethal Mark V Panthers, beasts of war that had become the primary nightmare of every Allied tanker. Clarke looked at his own strength, just under 90 M4 Shermans. On paper, the mathematics of the situation suggested a massacre. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1, and they were facing an enemy that possessed superior armor and guns that could pierce a Sherman's chest before the Americans even saw a target. Clarke knew that if he followed the traditional rulebook of armored combat, his command would be erased from the map by sunset, leaving Patton's flank wide open and potentially stalling the entire Allied drive toward the German border. As the sun struggled to pierce the gray shroud, the distant, rhythmic clatter of Maybach engines began to vibrate through the muddy ground. The German plan was a masterpiece of classic Prussian maneuver, a lightning strike to recapture Nancy and sever the American supply lines. Inside their Panthers, the German crews were confident, shielded by 100 millimeters of sloped steel and armed with the 75 millimeter KWK-42 gun, a weapon capable of decapitating a Sherman at 2 kilometers. They advanced in tight, disciplined columns, expecting to brush aside weak American outposts. However, Colonel Clarke was not a man of conventions. He realized that in the blindness of the fog, the Panther's greatest advantage, its long-range lethality, was nullified. He ordered his men not to retreat, but to disperse into the high ground, turning the landscape into a series of lethal ambushes. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and damp earth when the first shadows emerged from the mist at point-blank range. The unexpected twist, however, came from the Germans themselves. Despite their technological superiority, the crews of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were so fresh from the factories that many had never seen real combat. They were piloting the most advanced machines on Earth, but as they rolled into the Arracourt Valley, they were navigating blindly, unaware that they weren't walking into a breakthrough. They were walking into a meat grinder designed by a desperate American colonel who had decided to rewrite the rules of tank warfare on the fly.
The frantic desperation seen at Arracourt was the culmination of a dirty secret that had been bleeding the American Armored Corps white since the landings in Normandy. 6 weeks prior, during the chaotic breakout of Operation Cobra in July 1944, the long-awaited dream of open country warfare had turned into a horrific slaughter. Major Maurice Rose, a future legend of the 3rd Armored Division, stood in the mud of a French lane, watching in grim silence as the pride of American industry, the M4 Sherman, was systematically dismantled. The reports he sent back to Supreme Headquarters were clinical but devastating. He described witnessing American 75 millimeter and even the newer 76 millimeter rounds striking the frontal glacis plates of German Mark V Panthers at 600 yards, only to see them spark and ricochet harmlessly into the sky like pebbles thrown at a wall. Meanwhile, the Panther's long-barreled 75 millimeter gun could penetrate a Sherman from 2,000 yards, often before the American crew even realized they were being hunted. The tankers began calling their Shermans Ronsons after the famous lighter because they lit up the first time every time when struck. It was a crisis of confidence that threatened to break the morale of the entire First and Third Armies. The men felt they were being sent into a professional knife fight armed with nothing but a butter knife. When these reports reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters outside London, the atmosphere turned toxic. Eisenhower, usually a man of immense self-control, was reportedly livid. He had been promised by the Ordnance Department that the new 76mm high-velocity gun would be a Panzer killer capable of handling anything the Wehrmacht threw at them. He immediately summoned his chief of ordnance for a confrontation that would go down in military history. The excuse offered by the technical experts was staggering. They had tested the American guns against American armor plate configured to look like a German tank, but they had never actually fired at a captured Panther or Tiger. They had relied on theoretical tables and domestic steel, ignoring the reality of Krupp's hardened alloys and superior sloped angles. The unexpected twist arrived when Eisenhower ordered a live-fire test on a captured Panther in a field in Normandy. Before a crowd of silent officers, a Sherman fired point-blank at the German tank's front. The round didn't just fail to penetrate, it shattered on impact, leaving the Panther practically unmarked. It was a moment of terrifying clarity. The American Army had conquered the Atlantic and the beaches, but they were now facing a technological predator they literally could not kill in a fair fight.
As the shock of the Normandy live-fire tests rippled through the Allied command, Eisenhower realized he was fighting two wars, one against German steel and another against his own flawed intelligence. He ordered every captured Panther and Tiger to be hauled to testing facilities in England and France, demanding a brutal, data-driven analysis of the enemy's capabilities. British and American intelligence had previously estimated German tank production at a staggering 1,400 units per month, a figure that had paralyzed Allied planners with the fear of an endless iron tide. However, a team of statisticians began using a revolutionary method of serial number analysis found on captured gearboxes and wheels. The data told a different, albeit terrifying story. The Germans weren't producing 1,400 tanks, they were making only about 246 per month. But the trade-off was a nightmare of quality over quantity. The Panther was revealed to be a 45-ton Predator with 100 millimeters of frontal armor sloped at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of 140 millimeters, a barrier the Sherman's 75-millimeter gun could never hope to breach. The deeper the technicians dug into the captured machines, the more the myth of German invincibility began to fracture into mechanical reality. While the Panther's long 75mm KWK-42 gun could turn a Sherman into a burning pyre from 2 kilometers away, the tank itself was a temperamental beast. Testing revealed that the Maybach HL-230 engine was dangerously underpowered for its weight, and the final drive units, the Achilles heel of the Panther, frequently shattered after just 100 kilometers of hard driving. In contrast, the 30-ton Sherman was a marvel of reliability and ergonomics. It could be repaired in the field with a wrench and a spare part, whereas a broken Panther often required a factory-level overhaul. The unexpected twist came when statisticians realized that the very perfection the Germans sought was their undoing. By focusing on complex, over-engineered monsters, Hitler had sacrificed the ability to replace his losses. Eisenhower saw the opening. If American tankers could survive the initial long-range exchange, they were facing an enemy that was technically superior but strategically brittle. The war wasn't going to be won by building a better tank, but by exploiting the flaws of the perfect one.
General George C. Patton, Jr. was a man who lived by the sword and the clock, a student of history who understood that wars are not won by technical specifications alone, but by the relentless application of violence and speed. By early September 1944, he was fully aware that his M4 Shermans were outgunned and outarmored by the German big cats, but he refused to let his tankers develop a defeatist Panther complex. To Patton, the Sherman was not a dueling machine, it was a high-speed scalpel designed to slice through the enemy's rear and sever his jugular.
He argued that if a Sherman found itself in a head-on engagement with a Panther, the tactical system had already failed. His philosophy was built on the concept of system versus machine. He viewed the Third Army as a giant integrated engine where the tank was just one component, supported by overwhelming artillery, ubiquitous radio communication, and a logistics tail that kept the Shermans running while the over-engineered German panzers crumbled from mechanical fatigue. Tanks do not fight tanks, he frequently reminded his commanders. Armies fight armies. He believed that a reliable, fast tank produced in the thousands was strategically superior to a perfect tank that was too heavy for bridges and too complex to repair in the mud. However, Patton's aggressive doctrine was put to a brutal test when his Third Army suddenly ground to a halt east of Nancy, not because of German steel, but because of a dry fuel line. The Supreme Allied Command had diverted supplies to Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, leaving Patton's Shermans stranded and vulnerable, just as the German Fifth Panzer Army was mobilizing for a massive counterstrike. This forced Patton to refine his philosophy into a defensive necessity. He instructed his crews to master combined arms coordination, ensuring that every tank platoon was inextricably linked to forward observers who could call down a curtain of fire from 105mm howitzers within seconds. He didn't want his men to be brave, he wanted them to be smart. The unexpected twist came when Patton, despite his public bravado about the Shermans' adequacy, began secretly encouraging his ordnance teams to weld scraps of salvaged German armor and sandbags onto the Shermans' hulls. This field-expedient armor offered little ballistic protection against a Panther's long 75mm gun, but Patton understood the psychological reality of war. If his men believed they had a fighting chance, they would maneuver with the aggression needed to get into the Panthers' vulnerable flanks. He was preparing his system for the looming collision at Arracourt, knowing that the next 11 days would prove whether a good enough tank could defeat a legendary one. The morning of September 19, 1944 became the ultimate laboratory for Patton's system versus machine philosophy. As the 111th Panzer Brigade rolled toward the American lines at Arracourt, they were confident in their technical superiority, but they were navigating a blind world. The thick Lorraine fog had neutralized the Panther's primary advantage, its ability to kill at long range. Inside his Sherman, Sergeant William McBride of the 37th Tank Battalion peered through his periscope, his heart thundering against his ribs as the rhythmic clatter of German engines grew louder. Suddenly, the silhouette of a Panther emerged from the gray shroud just 500 yards away, dangerously close for a tank that could usually strike from 2 kilometers. The German crew, poorly trained and lacking the veteran intuition of the early war years, was scanning the distant ridgeline, expecting a traditional defensive line. They didn't see McBride. They didn't see the American system waiting in the tall grass. McBride didn't wait for a formal order. He barked a command to his gunner, and the Sherman's 75mm gun roared. The round struck the Panther's 40mm side armor, which was as thin as paper compared to its front, and the German beast vanished in a spectacular secondary explosion of fuel and ammunition. The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in tactical adaptation. As more Panthers blundered into the kill zone, the American Shermans used their superior turret traverse speed and gyro stabilizers to fire on the move, dancing around the lumbering German giants. While the Panther had to stop and carefully aim its long gun, the Shermans were already flanking them, guided by constant frantic radio coordination that allowed every tank in the battalion to act as one cohesive organism. The German commanders, stripped of their long-range dominance, found themselves trapped on narrow roads with ditches on either side, unable to deploy into combat formation. Whenever the Panthers tried to rally, American forward observers called in a time-on-target artillery strike, raining 105mm shells that shattered the Panthers' delicate external fittings and optics.
The unexpected twist came when the survivors of the first wave retreated, only to realize that the Americans weren't just defending a point on a map. They had used their superior mobility to encircle the entire German column in the mist. By the time the fog finally lifted, 11 burning Panthers littered the field, while McBride's platoon hadn't lost a single man. The inferior Sherman had just proven that in a knife fight, the one who strikes first and moves fastest wins, regardless of the thickness of the enemy's skin.
The startling reports from Arracourt reached Eisenhower's headquarters within days, sparking a heated strategic confrontation that would define the final year of the war. "I find you can't knock out a damn thing with the 76 millimeter, Eisenhower had famously barked at his ordnance chiefs, but the victory in Lorraine had created a paradox. On one side stood the proponents of quality, led by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who argued that the casualty rates were becoming unsustainable. Montgomery, having faced tigers and panthers since North Africa, insisted on accelerating the production of the heavy M26 Pershing with its 90 millimeter gun. He believed it was a moral imperative to give crews a tank that could win a head-on duel. However, General George Patton stood as the iron-willed champion of quantity and system. He argued that the Shermans' victory at Arracourt, where 86 German tanks were destroyed for the loss of only 25 American vehicles, proved that tactical agility was more vital than heavy steel. To Patton, the Pershing was a logical nightmare that would collapse bridges, guzzle precious fuel, and stall the momentum of the advance. The debate wasn't just about guns, it was a fundamental clash over whether the U.S. Army should be a scalpel or a sledgehammer. Eisenhower listened to the warring generals, weighing the technical blood toll against the cold logic of logistics. He knew that switching production to the Pershing mid-campaign would mean months of reduced tank availability, giving the Wehrmacht a window to rebuild its strength. Ultimately, Eisenhower made a decision that prioritized the system while acknowledging the human cost. The Sherman would remain the primary workhorse, but production would shift exclusively to models with 76 millimeter guns and the new Easy 8 suspension. He issued a new stern tactical guidance to all armored units: do not seek fair fights. He ordered his commanders to treat the Sherman as a component of a combined arms team, relying on artillery and air support to kill Panthers while the tanks focused on maneuver and exploitation. The unexpected twist came from the tankers themselves. Despite their fear of the Panther, many crews began to side with Patton. They preferred the reliable Sherman that would start in the morning and fit on a standard rail car over a heavy monster that might break down in the middle of a retreat. The decision was made. The U.S. would finish the war with a good enough tank, banking on the hope that their superior organization could bridge the gap where their armor fell short. December 16, 1944, brought the ultimate reckoning for the American system in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Hitler had unleashed his last great strategic reserve: 3 armies, nearly 30 divisions, and over 1,200 tanks, including the terrifying 70-ton King Tigers. These monsters, boasting 88 millimeter guns and armor that was virtually impenetrable from the front, were designed to shatter the Allied lines and seize the port of Antwerp. As the German Watch on the Rhine offensive slammed into a thin line of exhausted American divisions, the Sherman crews found themselves in a nightmare of ice and narrow mountain roads. The Panther's wider tracks gave it a temporary mobility advantage in the deep snow, while the Shermans struggled for traction on the treacherous slopes. Eisenhower, realizing the gravity of the breakthrough, turned to the one man whose system was built for such a crisis. In a high-stakes meeting at Verdun on December 19th, he asked George Patton how long it would take to disengage the Third Army, pivot 90 degrees, and strike the German flank. Patton's answer was legendary: 48 hours. While the German command relied on the sheer weight of their heavy steel to break the Allied will, Patton relied on the mechanical reliability of the Sherman and the unmatched efficiency of American staff work. The relief of Bastogne became the definitive proof that speed and logistics could defeat raw power. On December 22nd, the 4th Armored Division, the veterans of the Arracourt massacre in the fog, began an incredible 100-mile march through a blizzard. While the German heavy tanks were stalling in massive traffic jams or running out of fuel just miles from their objectives, the Shermans kept rolling. The system that Patton had championed functioned with surgical precision. Maintenance crews worked in the freezing dark to keep the tanks moving, while supply trucks pushed through the snow to ensure the fuel lines never ran dry. The unexpected twist came on December 26th, when the lead elements of the 4th Armored finally broke through the German encirclement to reach the 101st Airborne. The Shermans didn't win by outdueling the King Tigers in the streets. They won by arriving where the Germans thought it was impossible to be. By the time the skies cleared and the P-47 Thunderbolts began their hunt, the German offensive had already been crippled by the one thing no big cat could counter: the relentless, grinding tempo of an army that could move faster and sustain itself longer than the Wehrmacht ever imagined.
As the dust settled over the smoking ruins of Berlin in May 1945, the great debate over the Wizard War of Armor reached its final, undeniable conclusion. Throughout the grueling campaign, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the heart of the Reich, the M4 Sherman had faced a relentless barrage of criticism, often labeled a death trap by those who looked only at the thickness of its steel. However, the cold, hard data gathered by Allied investigators told a far more complex story of victory. In thousands of documented engagements, it was revealed that when American tank crews followed the doctrine established by Patton and Eisenhower, emphasizing maneuver, combined arms, and the first shot, they achieved a kill ratio of nearly 3-to-1 against the supposedly superior Panthers. The Sherman was never meant to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to be the best tank for a global war of systems. While Germany produced 6,000 Panthers in a frantic quest for a miracle weapon, American factories rolled out 50,000 Shermans. This wasn't just a victory of production, it was a victory of reliability. A damaged Sherman could be recovered, repaired with a crew with basic wrenches, and returned to the front in 48 hours. A broken Panther, with its over-engineered transmission and complex interleaved wheels, was often abandoned by its own crew, becoming little more than a static bunker waiting for an American airstrike. The true winner of the war was not a specific machine, but the organization that could learn faster than its enemy. Eisenhower's strategic vision and Patton's aggressive system had turned the Sherman into a tool of surgical precision. By the war's end, the American army had evolved from the naive units that struggled in the Normandy lanes into a lethal, integrated force where tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power worked as a single, unstoppable organism. The unexpected twist in the history of the Sherman is that its weakness was actually its greatest strength. Because the crews knew they were outgunned, they were forced to become the most tactically proficient tankers in the world. They mastered the art of the flank, the coordination of the time-on-target artillery strike, and the psychological edge of relentless momentum. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, but the Sherman was a masterpiece of warfare. As the veterans like McBride returned home, they left behind a legacy that redefined military doctrine for the next 80 years, that a good enough weapon in the hands of a superior system will defeat a perfect weapon in a broken one every single time. The Sherman didn't just survive the war, it proved that the most powerful component of any tank is the mind of the man inside it and the strength of the army behind it.